It's Maya. Good morning,
Good
Maya.
morning, Timothy. Good morning, Timothy. So thank you very much for being here again today. This is a special day,
Yes, it
and
is.
it is indeed. So this is election day for the upper house election, but I think that we'll remember it not because of the outcome of the election, but because of the, let's say, the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe. So everybody knows how it happened, what happened. And we know that this assassination is going to have repercussions on the Japanese politics and diplomacy as well in the long term. So, well, let's see what is happening right now, what happened last week, and what we expect to happen after the election. Without any further ado, so could you please start?
Thank you, Maya.
Anything?
So today I'm coming to you from the tip of the Miura Peninsula. The Miura Peninsula is the peninsula that is adjoined to Tokyo that contains Yokohama and Hayama. I'm at the very tip of that on a small little port called Misaki. This is the a place where the shogun, Anjin Miura, had his fiefdom. And I sailed here yesterday, and I'll sail back to home port Katsuyama tomorrow. Typically, I'm doing this briefing from the deck of the boat. I'm standing very close to the boat. I need to push off. The last time we did this, you might remember, they started untying me because another boat was coming in. A bit of a panic there. So let's try and wrap up this briefing a little bit early today. Typically, for those of you who are on for the first time, we have this video briefing for about 30 minutes. And then we close that up and we just continue on with the clubhouse question and answer. So we'll continue with that pattern today. My briefing today is a bit abbreviated. I had a lot of other things I wanted to talk about, but with the shocking shooting of Shinzo Abe on Friday, it really put a wrench into everything else. So it's a very sad thing to happen to Japan, to Japanese politics, and it's unavoidable that it takes precedence talking about that over everything else, even though there were a lot of very newsworthy things going on in Japanese politics last week, throughout the week. I think the impact of the removal of Abe in the political combination is so huge. It really deserves us talking about it. And plus, the passing of this great statesman deserves a bit of time and reflection. So with that, I'll get into it, and we can talk about other things in the Q&A. And if there are other things within the briefing that I give today on Mr. Abe and the passing of Mr. Abe, maybe we can get into that there. So as I think everybody who is on this briefing knows, Mr. Abe was pronounced dead at 5:03 on Friday. I heard about this actually live as it was going on. He was shot at around 11:28 on Friday morning. He was in the middle of a campaign speech in Nara. Nara is a little bit out of the way. It is an election district of Sanai Takaichi. She is a very prominent politician, female obviously, who ran for prime minister and lost to Mr. Kishida, you might remember, but received the policy position within the LDP. So she's not in the cabinet. She's within the LDP, but one of the 4 prime positions, she got that. Mr. Motegi got one too. He's not in the cabinet. He is in the LDP as well. So when the new prime minister gets it. He forms his cabinet, and also he appoints, as the president of the LDP, certain choice spots within the LDP. And this is her election district. Um, there are some interesting facets about the campaign being in Nada, but I think those kind of pale in comparison to what actually happened and the individual who shot the former prime minister. So let me get into that a little bit. I'd like to talk about what happened, what the theories are of what happened and how it happened, why it happened, and then I'd like to get into what happens next, what happens to the LDP, what happens to the Abe faction. So first of all, everybody understands what happened. It's very unusual, maybe not in Japan, but you know, he was shot at 11:28, and he was air transported out and reached the Nada Municipal Hospital at 12:30. That is a long time to be in transport, and his death was called at 5:03 the same day. He was shot with a makeshift shotgun. It was a handmade gun by a person who didn't have a whole lot of knowledge or experience in shooting or building guns. He had been in the maritime self-defense forces. So when, I mean, of the self-defense forces, the maritime is typically considered to be the best place to be. It is the highest, it's the most respected. There's the Air Force, there's the Army component too. He spent 2-3 years as a maritime self-defense forces bureaucrat in around 2005. So the impact of that experience to today is very diminished. He was something of a loner. He quit his job just a couple of years ago and was living by himself. So there are a lot of theories going on about, you know, how he manufactured the gun. He had some explosives apparently in his small apartment as well. Apparently he had a grudge against the Unification Church and thought maybe somebody of prominence would be there at the Abe presentation, the Abe speech. He wasn't, and so his next target was Mr. Abe. I think it probably came up somewhat spontaneously in this individual's mind. It doesn't appear that he's crazy or that he's kind of looping, but I mean, to do something like this obviously indicates that there is something like that going on in the background. But it also doesn't appear that he was picked up or hired or coached or facilitated in any way. So there are a lot of theories going around about, you know, the Yakuza. The Yakuza are typically strong in Nada. There is a prominent presence in Nada. There are frequent shootouts. There's a lot of hunting that goes on in Nada. There is an ample supply of rifles and mostly rifles and shotguns for hunting. That's, you know, Japan has one of the strictest gun laws in the world, and they monitor it very carefully, even ammunition. So it is difficult to conceive that he would be. I mean, if he was helped with somebody, they would have probably given him something better than what he had in his hands. The device that he had misfired. It didn't quite misfire, but he missed his shot. But it wasn't really a rifled bore to give him good accuracy. He had to be extremely close. So the first shot didn't hit his mark. I think it might have, one of the pellets might have hit the prime minister. He turned to see what the commotion was, and the second blast hit him. And the second blast, I think, caught him in the neck and in the back of the chest. But when he fell, he was also bleeding from the front of his chest too. So there was some puncture. There was some deep penetration there, probably exclusively from the second shot. The prime minister fell and was conscious very briefly, but fell into cardiac arrest, from which he never revived. They worked on him a little bit on the street, and an ambulance came, picked him up, and took him to a field where there was a doctor helicopter waiting for him. But that's an awful long time for a critical injury like that. And also, the Japanese just don't have that experience. The emergency medical team, which is not really a team that's assigned to inside these ambulances. Maybe in this particular case, they might have given the the prominence. They might have had a couple of more experienced people jump in the ambulance before it took off. But mostly in Japanese cities, ambulances are not really emergency care. They're mostly kind of taxis for people who are ill and sick. Not like in the United States. In the United States, the people are highly trained, highly skilled, and they've got all sorts of tools and equipment in their vehicles. That's not the case here. Perhaps in the helicopter, they had a little bit of time to prepare for that and the short trip to the hospital. But with that much bleeding, and in fact, when they finally called the death of the prime minister, the former prime minister, it was the cause of death was just a loss of blood. So the shock that is a consequence of that is what ultimately killed him. This news has riveted the nation. I mean, for the last 24 hours, ever since this happened all day Saturday, into the evening last night, in fact, all of the news channels are riveted on this story. It's difficult for anybody to do much else. In fact, in this show, it's difficult for me to talk about the other things that are going on. There's so much impact of the passing of Mr. Abe, and I'd like to get into that a little bit more. He was, by many accounts, the most prominent politician of the 20th century. And it's funny, many times you have prominent people in your life and in different circles that you run into that are not really recognized or appreciated until retrospection gives you that kind of historical lens to look at. When somebody's taken from you like Mr. Abe was, it does really bring that into focus. And I think it can be said with a high degree of certainty that he was the longest serving prime minister. His father was foreign minister, one of the best foreign ministers. There's so many legacies that his father even left to him. And then his grandfather was prime minister, Mr. Kishi, Nobusuke Kishi, who also had an assassination attempt on him in 1960. So it is not completely unheard of that this sort of thing happens, but it is so rare that it is so shocking, especially with a gun. It's just so shocking. I think even if you're watching the news and you're in Japan participating in what's going on, you have this sense, you probably feel it yourself like I do, but you have this sense of other people who are involved are just full of confusion. They do not know how to react to this kind of situation. The monumental aspect of this is so great. I mean, they haven't been able to process it. So you see newscasters stumbling over themselves. The press briefing at the hospital where a very short-tempered surgeon who was in charge of the surgery was taking questions. It just looked like a high school gathering. It was so ill-formed, and people were asking the same question over and over. The surgeon was not prepared, was not very well prepped for that. It was probably the first experience for him to have that much light and attention on him. But it was, it's just representative of what's going on throughout the entire country. Several countries have already announced days of mourning. The United States is flying flags at half-mast. I think Mr. Kishida has reserved taking that sort of action because today is election day. Half of the House of Councilors, the upper house, goes up for election today after an 18-day campaign period. We've been talking about the campaign period, the candidates, and the dynamics of that every week for the last, 5-6 weeks since it's really started to heat up. So when the foreign prime minister was shot, that news went, of course, directly to the prime minister's office. Many were who were on the campaign trail. In fact, all of the cabinet ministers were called back to Tokyo to have a special cabinet meeting. So they've been very busy in the prime minister's office trying to figure out what to do, how to handle this, what's the press release, what does the prime minister say, what are the international implications of that, but also what are the domestic implications of that. Mr. Abe, as you know, was the head of the largest political faction, 94 members in his political faction. It used to be the Hosoda faction. Mr. Hosoda, at the last election, turned it over because he became Speaker of the House, and Mr. Abe, who resigned as Prime Minister, slipped in. So he's been from prominent position to prominent position. 94 members is the largest faction in the LDP. There are maybe six, seven factions. One is kind of not there. The other is there, but it's not formalized. That's the Suga grouping. But his faction is almost twice as large as the second largest faction. So he wields real dominance in how the LDP decides things, even though he was not the prime minister any longer. This factional politics really dictates how the LDP moves. So one has to wonder, without his leadership, what's going to happen to the Abe faction. You'll remember that the Abe faction did not promote an individual as a candidate for prime minister within their faction. Very strange, very unusual. There are a couple of prominent candidates that he could have chosen, but he didn't. He went out of the faction and chose Sanai Takaichi to be his candidate of support. She did very well and received a strong position within the LDP as a consequence of that. She will run for prime minister again, maybe get it, but she was his champion for defeating Mr. Kishida. So one has to wonder what's going to happen under a Abe-less Abe faction with so many people that are involved in that part of the Japanese politics. One of the greatest things that is going to be decided in this election, or it was until Friday, was what's going to be the dynamic between the Kishida faction, who is number 4 in the rankings. So Mr. Abe is number 1. Second is Mr. Aso, then Motegi, then Kishida. And how people are elected and what factions they decide to join. So many are supported by but haven't claimed factional allegiance before the election. So they want to be somewhat independent, although they're receiving support, and maybe somebody from the faction is on the truck with them, patting them on the back, grabbing the microphone and speaking highly about them. But they won't announce their allegiances until after the election. And the factions are all fighting hard to woo these candidates into their fold. So factional politics, it's a characteristic, but it's a dominant characteristic of how Japanese politics moves. And in fact, the LDP, it's like a circus tent of groups, but it's also very much like different political parties because they fight really hard against each other. This fight between Mr. Kishida and Mr. Abe has been very famous. Mr. Kishida has been unable to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do, and Mr. Abe has been able to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do simply because of the number of people he has in his faction. So what happens with the Abe faction is a huge question mark. What happens in today's election is a huge question mark. So once again, today is the election. 1/2 of the House of Councilors, the upper house, that's 248 members. Half of them, 250 or so members, half of them go up for election today. In 3 years, the other half will go up for election. So it's staggered. There are 6-year terms. Of those, 25 are newbies. That means that they haven't had a political office. They're running for the first time. They're running in elections. And should these 25, it's unlikely that all 25 will win, but these 25 will be looking for a party to join, not a party, a faction to join. So they've definitely stated their claim that they're representing the LDP. Otherwise, the LDP wouldn't be giving them support. but the faction is something that they decide typically afterwards. So the question is, what's going to happen to the Abe faction? He has not selected a successor, even subliminally, as in selecting somebody to be his candidate for prime minister. He didn't do that. And also, there are a couple of people who are vying for positions of power who haven't really quite established it. So Mr. Abe really had a firm grip on the entire faction, and he dominated that faction, as you would expect. So what happens after this is anyone's guess. I have my own suppositions. Maybe we can kind of explore them a little bit in the Q&A. But there are going to be a lot of hungry people, even though they're respectfully being demure about their intentions. Once this election finishes, and once we get back to, getting to business after a respectful period of mourning, there will be a lot of change going on in Japanese politics. In fact, I can predict now, I think rather accurately, without even much sticking my neck out, that this incident is going to change Japanese politics. It's going to be tectonic in its impact on what happens with the revision of Article 9, which Mr. Abe was a huge proponent of. I think it will get a boost as a consequence of that. And I also think that today's election will have an impact as a consequence of this shooting, this assassination by this lone gunman. The election results today will be reported throughout the day. So afternoon, getting into the early evening, you will begin to get good numbers, and certainly by tonight, late tonight, most of the votes will be calculated and called. But in the last election, of the half of the members of the upper house in 2019, the LDP scored 56 members. So with that number and their coalition partner Komeito, who received, excuse me, 14 members, that gave them a majority in the upper house, actually very close to a supermajority. So the lower house, they still have a majority with their coalition. The upper house is a little bit more secure, but this election now, of this 124 candidates, will really tell us how impactful this shooting was. The number to watch tonight when the numbers come in is 56. 56 is what they did in the last election under the Abe administration. This year, they've in fact said, Mr. Motegi said that he wanted to see closer to 65 or 64 members, and that is a bit of a stretch target. If they scored 70, which is unlikely, they would have, the LDP would have a majority without the Komeito as a coalition partner of the upper house. So the numbers to watch now are 56. If the LDP scores 56 seats today, that would be viewed as a failure. Mr. Kishida would have to deal with that, and I think it wouldn't be very pleasant. If they score 63, which is Motegi's stretch target, that would be seen as a clear victory. I think that the numbers are open to speculation at this point. So please keep watching that. Let's see what happens. Let me see there. There's a lot more that we could talk about. Maya, I'm kind of running out of air here. Can we go into Q&A? Can we talk about other aspects of Abe? I did get a question about, what my personal relationship was, Mr. Abe. We could maybe get into that in the Q&A or now if you like.
We definitely can do that. Thank you. Thank you, Timothy. So yes, please then join us on Clubhouse so we can leave this live stream studio now, and I'll see you on the other side then, where
Great.
we can do more. Thank you for the briefing.
Thank you. We'll sign off here. I'll join you back in Clubhouse.
Yes, please. Yes, thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
see
you,
you.
everybody.